Good morning, everyone. My name is Meena Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs at Hofstra University, as well as the Director for the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. Both programs, the Public Policy Program and the Kalikow Center, are in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to Hofstra's first virtual event via Zoom for the public. This won't be the last. The university is continuing to find ways to offer public programs as we respond to the coronavirus pandemic. You'll be able to check the Hofstra calendar online for information about additional upcoming virtual events. As many of you know, this discussion originally was scheduled to be a panel on the state of the presidential race, evaluating the results of the second Kalikow School poll. Due to ongoing events, we have postponed that campus panel, but we wanted to take the opportunity to share the results of the Kalikow School poll and begin the discussion, which will continue on campus when we're able to do so. Let me just offer a very quick background about the Kalikow School poll. Some of you may know, I see familiar names in the audience, and we're delighted to welcome you. Thank you, students, faculty, community who've taken the time to join us today. And I should also say there are many people at the university to thank. A special thanks to the Office of University Relations, particularly Carla Schuster, for making this event possible today. Thank you. The Kalikow School poll is the second national survey designed by Hofstra, by the Kalikow School and the Kalikow Center, and it was conducted by the international online market research firm and data analytics firm YouGov. The focus of the Kalikow School poll is public attitudes on presidential elections and policy choices. The Kalikow poll oversamples suburban voters, building upon Hofstra's unique and foundational work in polling by the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Given the importance of suburban voters in recent elections, particularly the 2018 midterm contests and the 2020 nominating contests to date, Hofstra and the Kalikow School poll are focusing on how suburban voters' views on candidates and policy issues. Our first poll in late October 2019 took place in late October 2019. We discussed that in mid-November after the local elections. The second poll took place in early March 2020, March 5th to the 12th. It actually concluded just after the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak is a pandemic, and the poll concluded just after the president's White House address about the situation. Professor Craig Burnett in political science is the Kalikow School Poll Program Director. He has developed each poll, and he's closely examined, evaluated, and summarized the data for our discussion today. In a moment, he will highlight several of the key findings in the second poll. We also have an executive summary of the poll that is available on the Hofstra website for your viewing. After Professor Burnett concludes his summary, he and I will highlight a few of the key points that we see that we found in the results. We'll then open up the session to online discussion. We will ask you to submit your questions via the chat function, and then we will repeat for the group and address as fully as we can. So for now, let me turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Burnett, and may I ask that the audience, I see virtually everyone has done this, if you would mute your own audio, that would be helpful so that Craig's is the only audio that will be heard at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everyone for coming. This is a mostly virus-free presentation, although there is at least a couple points where we're going to talk about it. But yeah, this is a nice distraction. For me, you know, we had a survey all designed and ready to go into the field. We were ready to talk about the exciting race on the Democratic side, and then right as we're getting ready to go to the field, most people actually dropped out of the race, and it became sort of more or less decided in some ways. And so our poll changed pretty radically in the last couple of days, and we could not predict the future, so we didn't know the extent to which the COVID-19 virus would become a focal point, but clearly it has. So we will be discussing the ramifications of that. We don't have extensive surveys on that particular question because the world changed on us. We didn't have a chance to react to it. So thank you again for coming. Thank you for everybody who's helped make this happen. I'm going to jump right in, and that getting to the sort of the basics here. Let's see, where's my mouse? There we go. And it's always good to get out there with the methodology. How do we go around doing this? We have a sample of 1,500 total. The margin of error for that entire sample is plus or minus 2.9. For those who know what that means, that generally means plus 2.9 and minus 2.9 gives you a sense of how confident we are at that 95% range that those numbers reflect what the population looks like. Because these are in fact samples, we can't say with certainty that this is what the world is. When you break that down into the subsamples, you get, we have 1,000 people that are suburban residents, and that margin of error is a 3.5 plus or minus. Urban samples, 300, 6.5 plus or minus. You can see as you get into the smaller number of respondents, as my students in stats know, that tends to mean that you're going to get higher margins of error. And then 200 for a rural sample, and that's a 7.7. There's some information on the response rates. It's actually very good for an online panel to put some perspective on it. They do have to ultimately ask more people than they need. And in part, that's to be expected. The world is constantly being asked to do survey questions. But very good response rates overall. Let's start with probably where we always tend to go is how is Trump doing as of when we're in the field? And he's actually largely doing about where he was when we looked into this in the fall. He sort of has this really pretty slight range of approval. It dips, at some points down to the mid-low 40s, and never quite eclipses 50% for most polls, and that's what we find here too. And if you take this in perspective, where all the other politicians are, he's doing about as well as all of the other politicians. He's actually a little better than Biden, for example. The people that don't do as well tend to be McConnell. He's not very popular. And we actually did ask about Bloomberg. He ended up spending all this money. It's a natural question to ask him, what did he buy himself any sort of goodwill? And he actually polls the lowest in our survey, which may or may not be that surprising. He wasn't in the race all that long. The only person that does better than 50% is Obama, and I can't tell you other than that most presidents experience some sort of post warming effect in their numbers after they're out of office. How's he doing generally? In terms of the approval rating, he's a 47.9. That's his job approval rating. So it's very similar to his likability. He doesn't get great marks on direction of the country, although we can't say for certain, that's 100% reflection on him. But generally speaking, people are dissatisfied at 57%. In terms of the issues, they actually look more or less the same as they did in the fall. His best issue continues to be the economy. His worst issue tends to be healthcare. Race relations is another one he's not doing great on, neither with education. International trade, crime, those are all positives. Immigration is basically zero. Foreign affairs, his net is basically zero. So a lot of these end up being, excuse me, around he's not doing necessarily poor. He's not necessarily doing great. The only three issues that really do stand out in terms of his nets is the economy is a positive, healthcare is a negative, and race relations is a negative. We did actually do numbers for Sanders. I'm not going to report them as we say. In hockey, the primary is more or less all over except for the handshakes, although in this case, we don't really want to encourage handshakes, so maybe a bash or something like that would be more appropriate. But how does he do it with Trump and Biden? If Biden is presumably going to be his opponent, the spreads between Democrats and Republicans are pretty much what you would expect. They're each going to get more or less all of the Republicans or all of the Democrats, depending on which one you're talking about. Independents, actually, Trump does better. He does better, almost at 10 points. But if you look at one of the more key demographic areas in the suburbs, actually Biden does better. He does better by several points. Urban, and these again track very much what they look like in the fall. In the urban areas, obviously Biden does best. Rural tends to be the base for Trump. And overall, it's extremely close. Biden is very, very slightly ahead in our poll, but these numbers are that number is well within the margin of error. And so there was something that happened right before we went into the field that most of us who follow politics fairly closely realized that we'd never quite seen something quite like it, which was that the establishment of the Democratic Party more or less coalesced around a candidate right before Super Tuesday. And some of us watched this and said, well, to what extent is this going to matter? And it turns out, there's probably a good reason for that. And if you look at this question that we asked, which is whether or not people thought it was more important to support a candidate that either shared their values or had the best chance to win, Democrats really stand out here as a group that really cares about winning in this election cycle. If you look at the Republicans, obviously they think shares my values. Even independents, when they're thinking about the Democratic, they think somebody who has the values of the Democratic Party is more important. Democrats, not so much. In fact, the majority of them, 52.6, say, no, the best chance to win candidate is the one that they want. So it explains, at least I think in part, all of that movement that we saw on Super Tuesday and how much it tends to coalesce around Biden. At least I think that explains it. So that gets us into who are the people thinking about, now as we're sort of coalescing around two candidates here, who's going, we know who's going to be presumably going to be on the ticket for the Republicans. What about the rest of the ticket for the Democratic Party? And we put the numbers up here for Democrats and independents. We have them for Republicans and everyone else too, and that is in the executive summary if you want to take a deeper dive into that. And the two candidates that really kind of stick out are Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. I know also that Biden has said he's definitely going to pick a woman as his running mate. And so at least in the polling that we were in the field for, these are the two candidates that tend to do the best with independents. Kamala Harris does pretty well with Democratic voters, slightly better than Amy Klobuchar. Pete Buttigieg has a good little base of support. And then the rest here that are names that have been thrown around in the past aren't doing as well. But it's sort of surprising that at least in this particular stage of the campaign, there is a lot of people who think that Elizabeth Warren would be a good pairing for Joe Biden. And she certainly comes in with the credibility of the progressive part of the party. Whether or not that's a good ticket for them, because you open yourself up to having two individuals who are more advanced in age, and that's certainly something that Biden's going to have to contend with in the general. I don't know if that makes the most sense, but at least at this point, she's doing very well. And then we asked about, we had this, we were in the field, and it's been several weeks since the trial had happened. We wanted to take a pulse about how people felt about how that went down and whether or not they thought that impeachment was, they supported impeachment or the acquittal. Turns out it's close, right? And there's a huge partisan divide for both. Independents actually didn't support impeachment, and they actually supported acquittal in our sample. But again, you sort of see this pattern emerge that the suburbs, which is going to be a pivotal group in this election, are the opposite. They actually did support impeachment, and they did not support acquittal. And then you see the breakdowns kind of as expected in the relative matching of partisanship, where the urban voters tend to support impeachment and oppose acquittal. And that matches that they're more Democratic than Republican. The opposite would be true for the rural areas as well. But certainly that's what it looks like in the suburbs. And We asked two questions. I told you it would be mostly virus-free. Here's one of the questions that we were asking about COVID-19. And there's two travel bans that were enacted. One that's quite a bit older. That was the one on countries that had a history of terrorist activity. That actually enjoys some support. I think, somewhat to my surprise, it was basically a 50-50 proposition for Democrats. Suburbs support it, independents support it. It actually ends up having pretty broad support. COVID-19, it's actually much more, it's significantly more is supported by Democrats, not as much, but within a couple points of Republicans. Independents, again, suburbanites, urbanites, pretty broad support. And so, at least on that measure, you would think that Trump gets pretty high marks. And finally, we asked individuals to talk about how they felt about climate change, and we found that it was sort of remarkable how much people were willing to say that we should protect the environment over prioritizing growth. And we actually saw some differences on Republicans on this about how serious a problem they thought it was. And so some of this, leads. I think there is this growing consensus out there in the American public that whether or not you think it's a terribly, it's an important issue that needs to be dealt with right now, there tends to be this thought that we need to start thinking seriously about protecting the environment, even at the cost potentially of economic growth. And so that actually marks the end. And I'm just going to let's go back to the front here as a backdrop. But that marks the end of the formal presentation. So I'll hand it back over to Meena.
Thanks, Craig. We've raised a lot of topics here for discussion. Why don't you and I just speak for a few minutes about, I think there are three key issues that we may want to address, and then we'll open it up for broader discussion. The first point is about what the Kalikow School poll seeks to do. Because as you recall, just 2 weeks ago, you and I were working on finalizing the questions up until the morning of March 5th, which is when the poll went live. We did include in there, we were very pleased that we were able to be current up to the point of Senator Warren's decision, right, to suspend her candidacy. So we were as current as possible post Super Tuesday until the events, and then in that following week, just as the poll concluded, the national and international health crisis really exploded, right? And so I guess, but in some ways, I think that what's important to stress here is that the Kalikow School poll, when we designed it, when we introduced it last fall, was created to evaluate the state of American politics and elections at key points in time. And so we typically we're running 2 polls this academic year, planning to do 2 polls in the fall with the election coming. So an early September poll and probably one right before election day, a predictive poll, and then one in the spring, in the spring of 2021. So the purpose of our poll is not to capture immediate changes, moment by moment or week by week, but rather to identify underlying trends. And as you and I have been discussing, we've seen some remarkable consistency from the October 2019 poll to the March 2020 poll. Clearly, and probably the underlying point being that this is a very competitive presidential race. Now, of course, events that are unfolding could change that perspective. But what I found particularly striking, as you and I have discussed, and as it is presented in the executive summary, is the clear competitiveness of this presidential race. And I'm wondering if you would like to say anything about the comparison from the fall 2019 poll to the spring 2021 overall, and maybe particularly with reference to suburban and independent voters.
Sure. Yeah, I would echo that exact sentiment that there's been a remarkable amount of consistency, which is, as a pollster, by the way, that's great. You actually do want to see maybe not, you don't want perfect consistency, but you want some threads to be more or less the same, because the fundamentals haven't shifted that much. And here we are sitting today, and maybe the fundamentals have shifted or are shifting literally, right now.
Mhm.
But at the time we were in the field, there hadn't been any fundamental change in the nature of what had happened, with the exception perhaps of the impeachment trial. So it does, suburban voters, just to talk about them in general, still have a preference for a Democrat. It's not a huge preference. It wasn't a huge preference in the fall. It was possibly slightly higher for multiple candidates in the fall. Although, with any poll, you would expect a couple points to shift here or there. But the consistent, preference is there, and it is for, in this case, and we did run the numbers for Bernie as well, and they do prefer Bernie slightly as well. So it's not just Biden, but that seems to hold. And if you look at independents, it's shifted a little bit, but it's also possible that the sample is a little different, and that's important to keep in mind with these things. That every time you take a sample, it is for us, we don't have what's called a panel study. We don't have the same people every time, so you do expect some shifting in how your sample is collected, because they're new people, and those new people have different opinions. So it does look like, at least in part, that the independents possibly are more supportive of Trump in this poll than they were in the fall. Although at least some percentage of that might be because they have shifted a little bit. And there are other questions that have suggested to me that I've looked at that suggest that the independents are just slightly more conservative this time than they were in the fall. So if we do this again in this upcoming fall, it could shift back, or it could be about the same. I don't want to put any emphasis on either of those, but it's certainly, as somebody, I trust the numbers, and the numbers tell me that they're more in favor of Trump this time, and that's what I'm going to report, because that's what I think is actually happened.
Okay.
And so, Democrats still prefer, or excuse me, suburbanites still prefer Democrat. Independents seem to have shifted a little bit more for the Republicans at this point.
At this point in time. Okay, great. Thank you. And a follow-up for that you and I have been discussing, and again, that we highlighted in the executive summary, is the question of approval ratings, the net approval ratings on issues. And of course, this poll, right, which concluded 2 weeks ago, found that the president did the strongest on the economy, right? Just about a 5% net approval, favorability for versus approval versus disapproval. What I found interesting, and you referred to this in your slides, is that, great, thank you. Of the issues where there is the negative disapproval, or the negative net approval, sorry, healthcare is minus 4.8%.
Mhm.
And that falls outside the margin of error.
Mhm.
Race relations just falls outside the margin of error. It was, I think the margin of error for the overall poll is 2.9, right? And race relations
Yeah.
is
Mhm.
3.1. And foreign affairs, education, international trade and crime, which are positive, immigration negative, all within the margin of error. What do you think that suggests as far as how the president and the Democratic opponent, who at this point appears almost certainly likely to be former Vice President Biden, though of course the nominating contests are still to be continued. What does that suggest about the focus, the issue focus that is needed in this presidential race?
Right, and so, yeah, it's interesting because this virus taps into the two policy areas that people have given him sort of more decisive marks on. They also happen to be, and we didn't report these numbers here, but they are. It is true that they actually, these two issues, healthcare and the economy, are exactly what voters care the most about headed into this election, as of our survey in March. And so, if we look at these issues, education is one that's always kind of out there. It hasn't been a big topic of discussion at the national level for some time. International trade is one that has been sort of prominently on the agenda, but it is for a lot of people still kind of an abstract concept. Race relations too, could mean a lot of things. It has been much more on the national agenda, but not so much in the last, say, year or so, relative to where it was in the 2016 cycle anyway. Crime, again, is sort of a localized issue. Immigration, again, a very complicated, somewhat abstract issue for a lot of people. Foreign affairs, probably the most abstract for most voters. But people have a very good sense about what the economy is doing, right? And they not only feel it themselves, right? Because a lot of people, in our survey, they own a home, and they have a good sense about what their home value is doing. A lot of people, I just saw a survey out there today. Over 50-something% of families have money in the stock market. You can see what's happening with the stock market. If your neighbor down the street has a job or not. These are things that you don't need to do a deep search to figure out sort of how you're doing. Healthcare is the same thing. Everybody uses healthcare. Some people have some extenuating circumstances. They have to use it a lot, but they have a general sense about, can I get to see a doctor? Is it costing me a lot of money? Do I feel like if my child breaks their arm, can I afford to go to the ER? These are things that people have a pretty good sense about. And so the interesting thing for this is that you now have a global event happening that brings both of these issues to the fore. And so, is this going to change in some way? Or is it that here we are in March, and in 6 months from now, are we going to be sort of not thinking about this stuff anymore? But what we know is, before any of this really set in, and this was true in the fall, those issues were the most important, and they remain that way.
Correct. Okay, so again, we see quite a bit of consistency from in public attitudes from October 2019 to March 2020. The last issue that I want to raise at this point, before I open it for discussion, though we have several to discuss, are you able to put up the slide on the support for the travel bans? Because I
Yeah.
think that what is particularly, what I want to highlight here is that we did decide to include a question about a travel ban for COVID-19, which, when this survey started, seemed like a possibility, but we weren't right. I mean, we can go back and look at what was being said in February, what expectations might be, but we thought we would put this in just to gauge public reaction. And as you pointed out in your summary, when you look at these overall rankings, 2/3 support for the existing ban that the president issued starting in 2017, shortly after taking office, on travel from countries with a history of terrorism, almost 68% overall, and right, very high support among Republicans, close to 50% among Democrats, right? And then we can break it down suburban, urban, and rural as well. Those numbers for support are almost universally 2/3, or the lowest number of support is almost 50%. For COVID-19, even stronger. All of the numbers in support are above 50%. And several of them are approaching 3/4 when you look at the breakdowns that you have on this slide. From a policy perspective, a policy/campaign perspective, it seems to me that in political science, we talk about position issues versus valence issues, right? Issues on which you have a debate: higher taxes, lower taxes, healthcare, Medicare for all, or modifying the current system without a radical change. It seems to me from the poll results that valence issues, which are conditions or goals or symbols that candidates try to identify with, that these poll results indicate that valence issues matter. That in this presidential race, the candidate who is able to communicate or confidence on national security, public safety, will be able to make a stronger case to voters. I'm not sure if this necessarily means the specifics on what the travel ban, how that support might change. But to me, these numbers look like they clearly indicate support for kind of confidence in strength in national security and public safety. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I actually was somewhat surprised by the terrorism question. I think, and possibly a little surprised by the code one, in particular with Democratic respondents. I
Hmm.
assumed that it would generally be supported. There hasn't been any other public opinion that sort of said that the terrorism ban was sort of universally shunned. Even though there was a very strong response to it when it was initially announced. But that is to me kind of indicative of the fact that you still see it supported by 50% of Democrats. That there is sort of, I think, a disjoint between the more liberal elements of the Democratic Party than your probably rank and file, sort of not as liberal, um, more centrist Democrats out there. That it's not, the support for the terrorism ban isn't 20%. It's 50-50. I also actually thought that the Democrats would support the COVID-19 ban, even though when we first launched, it was sort of abstract, just because I thought that they would look at this issue differently. And it is higher, of course, but it isn't. I sort of thought they would be closer to like 65 or even 70%. And what I was hoping to do with this question actually was to show that the Democratic voters looked at these two issues very differently. What I take away from this is that they don't, not really, but also that the more liberal elements that had a strong reaction to the terrorism ban in 2017 isn't necessarily all that representative of how a lot of Democrats think about that issue.
Okay. Well, you're clearly raising the topics that we're planning to write about as we pursue in more detail, right? Our analysis of what these initial two polls tell us about public attitudes. We have some questions in there about how much information. We have some analysis of how information shapes voter views and other topics. Craig and I we wanted to say a little bit more about the presidential race, but I think at this point we could discuss climate change, vice presidential candidates, the favorability ratings. I think, why don't we open it up to discussion at this time? In our traditional setting, we would say that we would prioritize students first, and I can actually see on the list here some of our current students and some of our recent alums. It's nice to see the names on there, as well as several colleagues at Hofstra and at other institutions that we have worked with in recent months, and of course community members as well. We're delighted to have all of you here. I think what we said is that if you could type your question in, I can see it. You can send it directly to me, or you can send it to the group, and I will repeat it, and then Craig and I will address. So let's see, why don't we just give it a moment and see if anyone would like to submit a question? Oh, great. Okay, I just got one. I guess, so these have, okay, I got one for everyone, and I have one privately that came in. So let me put in the one that came in privately. The question is, what was once seen as a positive, does it now hurt Democrats to limit their vice presidential nominee to a woman? Craig, could you put up the vice presidential, that slide of the Democratic candidates? Thank you. Especially considering the recent national popularity of New York Governor Cuomo. And let me just say here, if you send me the question privately, I won't give your name unless you just note that it's okay. I'll just ask the question. And let me just say here, because I'll let Craig respond first, I also would like to address the, oh, Thank you, Jim. Nice to have you on the participating in the discussion. This is a question that I think has particular importance, given that former Vice President Biden said in the March 15th debate that he would select a woman as his vice presidential nominee. We see from these results that Senator Warren ranks does the best among Democrats as well as independent voters. We have some variation. Senator Klobuchar does better with independents. Senator Harris does better with Democrats. We also put in former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, who does quite well. And I should note, of course, that former Mayor Buttigieg does very well, but we'll focus on the women presidential, vice presidential candidates, given Biden's statement in the debate, and of course the question. So, Craig, I'll let you take that first.
Sure, and I have to start by sort of saying "I told you so" to my colleagues.
Oh, me?
When I brought up the idea that hey, Cuomo might be a decent candidate to run. Almost
that.
universally,
Okay.
anyone
Okay.
I floated this idea to was like, absolutely not, no way, he's never. And it's funny because, like, I mean, look, you know, it's funny to hear these things now that people go, oh, you know, Cuomo, he looks pretty good, and I go, yeah, he's, you know, we know. But the truth of the matter is, you know, so it's interesting. I don't know if, you know, he said it publicly. Yeah, I suppose it's binding, but it is funny to sit here and think about his candidacy, because if he had put, you know, there was for a long time a pretty, you know, those who follow New York politics closely sort of thought that he was lying in 2018 when he said that he was going to finish his third term as governor if he won, and he wasn't going to run for president. I was amongst them. I thought he was going to run. So when he decided not to, you know, there was a general surprise about that. But you know, he stuck to it, and you know, to his credit, he did make that promise, and he stuck to it. But I couldn't help but think about, well, what if he decided to run, and then you have this sort of juxtaposition going on between him and the president. Wouldn't that have been interesting to see? Here's what I do think, though, about the governor, and I followed him very carefully now for years. He really likes being the governor of New York. I think actually the thing that keeps him from running for president is that he really likes to be the governor. And I don't see him accepting the nomination for vice president. I just have a hard time seeing that. I think he would think it's a pretty significant step down. I think that if he was truly interested in presidential politics, he would have jumped in this time. It is an interesting thought. I just don't see it happening. But you know, I've been wrong many times before, so this wouldn't surprise me either.
Well, political science is not just predictive; it's also analytical. I would have to say, I agree with your assessment, maybe for slightly different reasons. I think that Biden, former Vice President Biden, would face a significant significant resistance within his own party were he to backtrack on the statement that he made about about nominating, selecting, asking a woman vice presidential candidate to be on the ticket with him. I would also say for Governor Cuomo, while he is clearly he's getting high marks pretty much across the board for his crisis leadership, we've also seen that in another another New York politician, namely former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who post 9/11 governed, was viewed very favorably in New York City, statewide, nationally, for his crisis management after the terrorist attacks. 7 years later, when he ran for president, Giuliani staked his campaign on Florida, and that proved to be a strategic mistake for many reasons, and obviously that was not a successful campaign. So I guess I would say, and thanks to Jim Cole for raising this important issue, I do think there are some immediate circumstances don't necessarily indicate what will work well for the ticket. I would also just add that having Biden from Delaware and a vice presidential candidate from the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic area, I think that's probably the biggest challenge with the Senator Warren's prospects, I would say. I would also just add that it's an interesting challenge that Biden was not doing very well in February. And in fact, all of us know after Iowa and after the former vice president left New Hampshire on election night, the night of the primary, people were widely saying that this candidacy was over. It turned the tide in South Carolina with a 30 percentage point victory. Does that mean that how is that rewarded, the voters that have been loyal to the vice president? Well, I would say it depends on what will work best in November. And while South Carolina was crucial to Biden's success in the Democratic contests, that may not be that can't be the only factor, I would say, for the Biden campaign looking ahead to November. So again, to get back to this question of the vice presidential nominee, it's not just the current situation or who the popular candidates are within the Democratic Party, but who will help the Democratic nominee win in November. We have a second question here from Professor Rosanna Parati in political science. So I'll just shift. Craig, if you don't mind shifting to the question on climate change, which we found very interesting. Oh, and now lots of questions are coming in. Okay. Second question is Craig, for you, were you able to see a difference between young likely voters and older likely voters on climate change, particularly among Republicans?
I didn't break this out by age. I suspect that we would. That it's pretty. I mean, I don't anticipate any difference in our poll that you would find that spread. That younger voters tend to take this more seriously and think that this is a problem they're going to have to face more than those who are not in a certain say the 18 to 35 range is what it was. But we didn't break it out by age, but I suspect that that's true.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. And let me just follow up on that, Craig. I think because on this slide, one of the items that really surprised us, because this was a follow-up question that we added about whether climate change is an important issue. And what was surprising to us is that across the board, again, 2/3, 68%, said protecting the environment is more important than prioritizing economic growth. 94% of Democrats said that. Nearly 40% of Republicans did, and 2/3 of independents, suburban voters, and urban voters said protect the environment over prioritizing economic growth. What does that say about the policy agenda for Washington after the 2020 presidential election?
Well, I mean, so there's consensus on this issue, but there's consensus on lots of issues, but clearly not a consensus in the Republican Party still. So if the Republicans tend to control government, that they're not necessarily going to go with consensus. But even on issues that tend to show this, and we didn't present the numbers on gun control, but gun control sort of matches this in some ways, that there tends to be a consensus on that issue, but it's one of those policies that's extremely hard to get movement on. And so most of this happens, most of the policy battles tend to happen where they're happening now, which is administratively, right? So the EPA and who's in charge tends to make rules and tends to govern through non-legislative actions. And so unfortunately, that's where I think this tends to be. It sort of matches guns in that way, that you don't get a lot of legislative movement on it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this, but I've received a few questions privately as well as publicly, so let me just go through them. One of them is a very I think a pretty quick one to address. Of the survey participants, what percentage are likely voters? We did sample likely voters, right? Not registered voters. And
Right.
Could you just say a little bit about that, the reasoning for that methodology?
Yeah, so this, one of the screeners that we have is that we wanted a likely voter methodology here. That we're more, even though we understand that changes somewhat over the cycle of the process. We wanted to keep it consistent. So when we asked in fall, we screened for likely voters then too. Um, so there isn't, this is obviously, we can't guarantee that these people are going to actually vote, but they're reporting that their likelihood of voting is extremely high. And so there are no non-likely voters in this sample.
Okay, great. Thank you. And of course, our reasoning behind that is that it is more likely to be predictive. Traditionally, I think polls that look at registered voters tend to slightly, right, they may kind of overestimate Democrats.
Yes.
Likely voters may slightly overestimate, right, Republican voters. But we were going with who is most likely to cast a ballot in November.
Correct.
All right, thank you. The next two questions I have, one is private and then one is public, about vice presidential candidates. So why don't we turn back to that? The survey, the question is, did the survey ask for demographic data among survey respondents, on for the different candidates for vice president? And do we see any differences based on race and ethnicity for the candidates? And with particular reference, this question asked about whether this would be important, how this will be important for certain demographic groups, such as, for example, African-American voters being perhaps motivated to, especially motivated to vote in places where this could be within the margin to shift a state.
Right, and that's a great question. You and I both know that the vice presidential candidate very rarely has a significant effect on anything with turnout or voting. But it's still fun to think about, because what if there is a star candidate out there that you would want to put on the ticket? That it's a little tricky. That we didn't really design the survey to do that. So you could break these numbers down by their demographics, but they wouldn't necessarily constitute a sample that would be large enough to have any predictive power to them. Especially if you're looking at like, maybe you could do it with age. And I don't suspect you would find maybe a huge component on age on any of these candidates. But I would be very reluctant to do it by something like race. I don't know that I have enough of a sample to be able to say confidently that there'd be enough of a subsample to make any sort of predictive analysis.
Okay. Well, and I think this is really, it's a very timely and important question as we look at how the democratic decision-making process in the coming weeks and months. I think that when you look at the trajectory of the Biden campaign, from the Iowa was expected, but then New Hampshire departing, leaving for South Carolina, right? The question of really what is happening to the Biden campaign, the issues with fundraising, right before before South Carolina, there was an article that said that the Biden campaign had only one office in California, and the Bloomberg campaign had, I think, close to 24. Same with the Sanders campaign. And then when you see this 30 percentage point victory in South Carolina, seems to me an instinctive thought as well. Do South Carolinian voters deserve some sort of a reward, right, for their loyalty? Particularly African-American voters, Representative Clyburn and the work that he did, not just in endorsing the former vice president, but also in what we now know in giving very important strategic advice the week before the South Carolina primary. So there are a number of variables here. And yet, when we look ahead to the general election, I meant to look this up before our session. South Carolina voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, right, when 49 states, every state but Minnesota, voted Republican. I'm trying to look back to see, I'll have to double check this on when South Carolina last voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in the general election. So again, victory in the contest doesn't necessarily mean a reward for November.
Right, and I don't know, it'd have to be Clinton. right? I mean, that
Well,
would,
that's the one I was going to say, but I wanted to double check that. It was
yeah, that's the only one
probably
that
92
comes.
and 96, but
Yeah, it's the
I'll
only
double.
one that comes as a possibility,
Right,
or
right,
Carter, I guess, maybe Carter. Um, yeah, but yeah, I mean, so you're right in that. Yeah, and I think it comes down to how do people view, primaries, right? And so we know that Democrats aren't going to win Mississippi. They're very, very unlikely to win South Carolina, like almost extremely unlikely. But they do,
right.
as a primary elector, right? They have something, each state has something to say. And so we look, why have we gone to Iowa so many times? And at least in part, it's because it's this retail politics kind of state, and it's small, so candidates can traverse it, and it offers them a chance to kind of break out and get their name known. And then we have New Hampshire as a sort of first primary.
Correct.
And South Carolina is a little bit more representative of the diversity of the Democratic Party, and I think that's why we paid so much attention to it.
Correct. Correct. Okay, I think we'll have time for a couple more questions I see here. Let me turn to this question about policy. Was there any, and this is, everyone can see this, was there any evidence of a shift in the Democratic Party toward the progressive policies of Senator Warren in our poll?
Um, Not okay. So we didn't ask a ton of those specific ones. We do have a couple. Um, and so the two that stick out is healthcare, and then we asked a question about reparations. Um,
Could you
and
could you put up the slide about the net attitudes?
so
Maybe that'll be helpful here.
talking about this
Yeah.
one.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you. I know you'll be talking about other issues.
Yeah. So, um, actually, healthcare was fairly flat. In that, it's sort of this idea that has support, and then if you support it, you really support it.
Correct.
And it doesn't matter what kind of insurance you have, you're all in on it. But it's not a very popular issue. It's somewhat popular with Democrats, but not with others, and not with sort of the key demographics we're looking at in the suburbs and independents. Um, and with race, with reparations, it was there's some support out there, but it's not widespread. If you go down to say the suburbs, they're open to the idea of programmatic infusions of cash into programs that would help descendants of slaves, but not so much cash payments. And still, I think the plurality was support for just an acknowledgement, and not necessarily spending of money on it. So it's not necessarily the case that either I would say Sanders or Warren in this case have moved public opinion tremendously within the party itself, or broadly, but right, certainly is safe to say that those issues that have moved somewhat over time. That I think if we were running these in 2016 or before 2016, you would find that opinion in the party has changed quite a bit, but not necessarily in the last 6 months or so, which you wouldn't necessarily expect it to move that much. But the party has probably moved, but it wouldn't necessarily be showing up in our poll.
Let me just add here, I'm glad you brought up the question of the reparations question that we asked in the poll. If the executive summary, which includes both the highlights, the tables that you created, as well as answers to each question, are available on the Hofstra website. And so if anyone wants to look at those, for the reparations question, as I recall, we had 4 answers, right? That there should be a programmatic changes, as well as programmatic programs for addressing the legacy of slavery in the United States, as well as cash payments, programs but no cash payments, and then there shouldn't be anything done at all. And then there was a 4th one as well. Do you recall what that was?
Acknowledgement.
Acknowledgement.
Sort of the acknowledgement of the harms of slavery was the sort of the 4th one there.
Correct. And we
More of a formal, acknowledgement by the government, I think, is what
correct.
you're going after.
And if anyone would like to see that question, how it was, what it was formulated, and the answers, those are all available in the executive summary. I've received two more questions privately that we'll try to address before we conclude. One of them follows up on our discussion about the November election, the general election, where a listener points out that turnout among African American voters went down significantly in 2016 from 2008 and 2012, and not commensurately in other demographic groups. So for the Democratic Party, turnout from African American voters will be critical for the Democrats, for their plan for victory, right? For their strategy. This was, of course, critical for former Vice President Biden in South Carolina. Any thoughts on what that might suggest for how the Biden campaign identifies a vice presidential candidate?
It might matter, or it might not, honestly, because he's clearly able to get the support of the African American community. I mean, that was the message that was clear from South Carolina in subsequent primaries, that he has a strong base of support in the African American community. Will they be energized for him? I don't know. Probably not in the same way that Obama could energize him. At the same time, maybe Obama's attempt to motivate people to go to the polls will work better with Biden than it did with Clinton. I don't think it was for lack of Obama's trying but I think maybe it's just the candidate that might matter. However, that being said, it's possible that your selection of a vice presidential candidate matters here, and so maybe this is where Kamala Harris makes a lot of sense. But is that going to be an extra motivation? Maybe. I mean, it depends. I suppose if you think that, if sort of the rumors that are out there that he's only going to do one term if he wins, or that's really, this will be the passing of the torch to the next person. Maybe. But I don't know that he needs to build. That he certainly doesn't need to build name recognition. He certainly doesn't need to build support. He's just got to get that turnout question answered, right? And to some extent, this will have answered itself, right? Because the 2016 election, everybody assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and it depressed turnout. And anytime you have an election where it's either really close, which 2016 was about as close as it can get, or it's a surprise, as was the case in 2008 with Obama won North Carolina. It was a genuine surprise. The next election cycle always sees a bump in turnout, right? And so those states like Wisconsin, that it was kind of a surprise. You're probably going to see more turnout anyway. So whether or not you can get your base to turn out is what's going to matter.
Well, and I think that's turnout from party loyalists will be key. And we know, we discussed earlier, the last time a vice presidential candidate was selected for geographic, right, for votes was Lyndon Johnson in 1960 for then Senator Kennedy. When we look at the vice presidential criteria, certainly geographical diversity does matter for kind of broadly for bringing out votes. Demographic characteristics matter. I would say national visibility. One of the reasons why we put in former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams in this survey is that she ranked highly on all of those issues, built a very high national platform, obviously has a lot of support within the Democratic Party, and as a candidate from Georgia would complement the vice president. So I think in addition to the candidates for the presidential race in 2020, the Democrats and the Biden campaign will be looking outward as well. Let me just say in wrapping up, we've gotten a question about, did we rank issues that were most important to voters? My recollection is we did not. That's right. We asked about issues, but did we prioritize?
We did not ask them to rank. We asked them to tell us how important issues were on these. Actually, these slate of issues here, actually, that we're looking at: education, international trade, the economy, and so, et cetera. And they were given, options of very important, important, not very important, that sort of structure to them. And just to tell you that the two that stood out. Were the economy and healthcare, and they had amongst the entire sample almost it was 70% of people who said very important. That doesn't even include those who said at least that it was going to be important. So almost everybody thinks that it's going to be very important, with fewer, with less consideration for all of these. That some people think they're important, but those two really were head and shoulders above in terms of their importance.
Correct, correct. And then the last point I'll just make here, audience member has pointed out that another criterion for the vice presidential candidacy will be age, certainly, as we look at, as the Democratic Party, right, for the Democratic campaign looks ahead to November and what comes after.
And I would add experience
Oh,
to that, because there's at least, and this was true of the last cycle as well, that the candidates are going to be in their 70s, and so I think it harms a candidate that's in their 70s to have somebody that's not very experienced on the ticket. So you'll want somebody who hasn't, so I mean, that's where I think like a Pete Buttigieg is not necessarily a good fit. Because it kind of undermines the message that Biden is going to go out there with, which is, I'm experienced. You should give me control because I know what to do. Well, what if he unfortunately were to pass away, right, or become very sick or something like that? Well, then it sort of, that was the counter narrative to McCain in 2008, even though he had a governor on the ticket actually, but the feeling was that she wasn't experienced enough or didn't know enough about international politics to be a viable president. And so I think, in addition to age, I think experience will also be a factor.
well, these are questions that we will continue to discuss, not just in the context of the poll, but as we move forward in the presidential race. We greatly appreciate, I regret that we have to stop the questions now, but we are out of time. Thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, Craig, for your insights and analysis and all the work you've done on the second Kalikow School poll. We look forward. Thank you, Jim, for those very kind words. Thank you, Dean Rifkin. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Please stay tuned to the Hofstra website for more information about our forthcoming events. And I see a former student writing in as well. Thank you, Angela. Thanks all. We'll conclude for now. More information to follow on our upcoming events and on our fall polls. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful, stay safe and well.